Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good Thursday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with you from the National Weather Service in Anchorage. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information. You can do that very easily by going online at weather.gov/Alaska or /Anchorage/Fairbanks or /Juneau, whichever way you like. The weather info line is always open at 800-472-0391. You can find out more information about the weather story in between the Alaska weather shows at NWS Alaska on Facebook, on Twitter, NWS Alaska. They're using the hashtag AKwx. You can also get more localized information if you follow NWS Juneau. They're talking about rainfall, NWS Anchorage talking about wind, and NWS Fairbanks talking about wind, waves, and probably some snow up across the North Slope. The YouTube channel is always NWS Alaska or NWS Anchorage or Fairbanks. We'll get you there as well. You'll get your daily afternoon map briefing in that way, and you can get a sneak peek at the surface weather charts we're going to talk about on the Alaska Weather Show a little bit earlier in the afternoon. Here's a look at the hazardous weather situation across southeastern Alaska. All the yellow shaded boroughs that you see there are indicating a flood advisory at this point. Flood watches have been canceled, but we're still watching some of those rivers and streams because there has been a pretty tremendous amount of rain here with the first wave. The second wave still working through and will continue to do so tonight and tomorrow. The first wave has brought about 1 to 3 inches of rainfall for a good part of southeastern Alaska. Those rainfall rates were on 1/4 inch to I believe about 1/2 inch an hour at times, which is pretty high up there. And if that continues, that could mean storm totals would be on the order of about 3 to 6 inches in general, but there's probably going to be some more localized spots that see significantly higher amounts. So with all that rain coming down, no surprise that streams and rivers have been coming up, but there hasn't been that many reports of flooding or mudslides or any damage at this point, and certainly not any big river rises that would prompt us to be concerned about a flood warning. So right now we've just got flood advisories posted, but that is still an action stage. That means you need to be aware of what's going on, be mindful of river levels where you are, and if that is a place where the water could come up quickly and you might be impacted by that, you still want to maintain some awareness there and be ready to move in case a flood warning is issued. Flood watches have been canceled right now, so that means that we're not as concerned with, we are looking at flooding as a possibility, and there might be some minor flooding in the area, but the extreme or more dangerous level of flooding probably isn't occurring at this point, but be mindful. As we look northward toward Ambler and out toward the west coast, we've got some wind to deal with, and wind blowing through some of the passes there up to about 45 miles per hour will probably keep things a little bit rough and tumble through the rest of the evening hours there. So about 10 o'clock or so, the wind advisory should be dropped, but flying through some of the passes on the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range, especially around the Ambler region, you should expect to see probably some stronger wind gusts there, at least through the remainder of the evening hours. So a wind advisory is posted there until about 10 o'clock. Now for the St. Lawrence Seacoast, mainly the northern edge of the St. Lawrence Island, high surf advisory is in effect. You're looking at waves around 8 to 12 feet just offshore. Some of that's going to be crashing up on the beach, probably creating some beach erosion or perhaps sloshing a little bit of water up a little bit farther onto shore than it normally goes. So that's going to go at least through tonight into early tomorrow morning. So watch for some stronger northerly winds. What's going on with the weather situation that we're getting all the wind up north and all the rain down south? Well, typical fall pattern here. We've got a strong area of low pressure out across the Gulf of Alaska that you'll see here in just a minute, but that is dragging in some pretty hefty northerly winds right through the Bering Strait and reaching St. Lawrence Island. The other impact that's going to happen on the backside of this weather pattern for Alaska is remnant moisture and storm energy from Typhoon Kilo. That is working up across the western Bering Sea at this point, and that's that big mass of clouds that you can see working northward east from the Sea of Japan and up toward the Kamchatka Peninsula. Still days away from making it into the Bering Sea, but there's a pretty decent load of moisture with this, and this is all moving northward. So as it goes, we'll probably get maybe a little taste of that here in the coming week or so. You can also see some other tropical disturbances across the mid and western Pacific. Those are traveling westward at this time. As we look at Alaska, it's pretty easy to see that we have tapped tropical moisture now across southeastern Alaska. No doubt a lot of this is just being wrung out right there in place. So as this is traveling in from southwest to north and east, it's just hitting the higher terrain, and all of that moisture being wrung out, again, creating 1 to 3 inches of rainfall that we know about earlier this morning. And perhaps as much as 3 to 6 inches by the time it's all said and done with this second big push of moisture. On top of that, we've had showers and thunderstorms across Prince William Sound and across some of the more interior locations there, just a sign of the tremendous amount of upward motion in the atmosphere thanks to low pressure across the north and western Gulf. Now on the back side of this is where we're getting those northerly winds reaching St. Lawrence Island again. That's creating the high surf there and dragging a lot of wind through the gaps and the passes across the Brooks Range. It's also created showers and probably a couple thunderstorms across southwest and the interior. We've seen lightning strikes on our weather monitors at the National Weather Service office, and no doubt that trend may continue across south central and into the coastal waters of southeast tomorrow, especially up around Yakutat into some of the northern entrances there. So mariners, be on your guard that if thunderstorms do develop, that's going to probably create some gusty winds, some very choppy seas, and also the threat of lightning that you should be well prepared for. Here's a look at the weather map. Across the north, a stationary boundary is holding back a lot of the cold. There have been some areas of light snow across the north slope again. Rainfall a little bit further south, and again, a very energetic storm system across the southern third of Alaska. Out ahead of this, the frontal boundary is wringing out the moisture for southeast, periods of moderate to heavy rainfall there. And also looking at some thunderstorms across Prince William Sound and southwestern Alaska today. The main part of this low pressure system is a 984 millibar low, so not horribly deep, but certainly enough to get your attention. And I like to say a lot of the time, this isn't something to write home about. This might be pushing that boundary a little bit. You might want to lick a stamp and get ready. Out across the north, you can see a couple areas of clouds across the Bering. A lot of that indicating that there's cold air aloft. And this sign on the satellite picture tells us that that cold air is escaping the Arctic and dropping southward. So no surprises that we'll continue to see more and more clouds dropping south on the backside of this weather system. As we head into tonight, low pressure is already filling in a little bit. 985 millibars there as we head into tonight and tomorrow. Periods of moderate to heavy rainfall will continue across southeast and Prince William Sound and the northern Gulf Coast. Northward, light snow should continue with a frontal boundary lingering very close to the north slope and over Kotzebue Sound, where precipitation will likely be a little more mixed and showery in nature, especially the further west you go. The winds will be out of the north for most areas across the west coast and Norton Sound and the YK Delta. As we get into Friday, you can see precipitation starting to wind down across the YK. Frontal boundary dropping toward the Alaska Peninsula, and low pressure continues to fill in and weaken at 1,002 millibars. Periods of moderate to heavy rainfall will still be possible across parts of southeastern Alaska. Light rain will start to wind down across south central, with winds letting up a little bit more in a few more places. Periods of rain and snow will continue across the north slope and the Arctic coast, and by the time we get into Saturday, a lot of that really kind of refocuses across the north. For areas across the west coast, an onshore flow coming in from the west will keep things soggy from the YK all the way into Norton Sound and the Seward Peninsula and Kotzebue Sound for that matter. For south central, an area of low pressure establishes itself right around the Alcan and just north of Whitehorse, dragging in some drier air across the western parts of the Alaska Range. That should create a little bit more of a brighter spot for Cook Inlet, Shelikof Strait, maybe even Kodiak Island, but it will also improve the winds, or increase the winds, I should say, for many areas in those same locations. Showers will start up across the Alaska Peninsula again, and high pressure starts to strengthen at 1,032 millibars for the central chain, with periods of rainfall continuing for south and east. A look back through today, we saw temps back in the mid to upper 50s for southeastern Alaska. Many areas along the outer coast made it up to about 60 degrees. The same goes for parts of the Queen Charlottes and Haida Gwaii. 54 around Cordova, 52 in Valdez. Kenai made it up to 60 today, 58 in Anchorage with 55 in Talkeetna. Lower 60s for Fairbanks with about 61 degrees in Fort Greely, 54 in Healy, 65 in Eagle. Northward, we got a taste of the colder weather around AKwx Pass with IFR conditions there, 36 around Arctic Village, and 43 in Fort Yukon, about the same there in Bettles this afternoon. Temps hovered right around the freezing point for most on the Arctic coast. Barrow was 31, 34 in Kaktovik, 30s and 40s for most of Kotzebue Sound, including Kotzebue at 43, 47 in Nome, 46 in Unalakleet, 46 today in Galena with 59 in McGrath. Out toward Bethel it was 51, 46 in Nunivak Island. St. Paul and St. George both hovering about the mid to upper 40s today. Bristol Bay saw temps in the lower 50s with Kodiak Island at 57. As you get down toward Sand Point, temperatures were also in the lower to mid 50s there for Cold Bay and False Pass, a little bit cooler for both areas. 48 in Dutch Harbor, Unalaska, and mid 50s for most areas in the central and western chain, a little bit cooler in Adak and Atka. Overnight low temperatures will stay above freezing for most of the interior and southwest with temps in the upper 30s and lower 40s. South Central stays in the mid 40s overnight. Lower 50s for most of southeast, a little bit warmer as you head down toward the Dixon entrance. Klawock and Annette and Ketchikan probably in the mid 50s in fact. Upper 40s for the Alaska Peninsula, and the central and western chain will also stay a little bit on the mild side tonight, about 50 in Kodiak as well. High temperatures tomorrow could warm into the upper 50s for most of the interior. A lot of rain will be seen by many places south of the Brooks Range thanks to this very large and controlling weather system that has a lot of moisture wrapped up in it. So don't be surprised if you have clouds and you have rain and your daytime temperature suffers. However, some of the warmest spots will still be out ahead of this weather maker. Because of that, many along the Alcan border will get close to that 60-degree mark if you're in the Yukon Flats and southward toward Northway. As you get down into South Central, upper 50s for many around Prince William Sound and westward. Kodiak Island still holding near 60, mid to upper 50s for southeast, lower 50s for the Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula, about 48 in St. Paul, still not too cold yet, 47 around Bethel, 43 in Nome, Kotzebue looking at 41, and Barrow expecting a high of 33 with about 34 around Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse. Flying weather tomorrow includes IFR, especially along the North Slope and for parts of southeast in the morning, but look for some big improvements during the daytime. South Central will be flirting with MVFR conditions across the southern parts of the Kenai Peninsula and most of Prince William Sound, and a wide swath of IFR across the western Bering Sea as moisture continues to travel northward from Kilo. As we look at pass conditions, expect IFR in AKwx Pass and for Adigan Pass tomorrow. We would expect MVFR conditions through most of the day for Lake Clark and Merrill Pass. Rainy Pass should be MVFR through most of the day. Windy Pass, we expect to see IFR conditions to start the day. Isabel Pass, also expecting to see MVFR conditions throughout your Friday. Mentasta Pass should be marginal. Tanita Pass, we expect VFR to start, but look for degrading conditions as the day goes on. MVFR conditions there. And for Portage Pass, most of the day at MVFR. IFR conditions to start as we saw in southeast, but big improvements should be seen for more areas to the south and at least to MVFR for Chilkoot and White Pass during the day. The freezing levels indicate our weather pattern is under the control of a large trough of low pressure in the upper atmosphere. And if you follow these lines here, it makes kind of a U shape. This is telling us that colder air is dropping south across the Bering. We saw that with the satellite picture. We've seen that with the wind patterns and the weather patterns at the surface, and now the freezing levels confirm this once again. 8, 10, even 14,000 foot freezing lines across parts of southeast. That means a lot of warm airs over here and a lot of cold airs over here. Here's the surface freezing line down to the Brooks Range, and again, no doubt we'll see periods of rain and snow mixed across the North Slope as a result of that. Icing potential, though, is still pretty high up there as we take a look at the bulk of the moisture and the real big levels that you need for rime and clear ice up across some of the North Slope. Above 10,000 feet there to get any significant icing, and most across the west coast above 9,000 feet. Also across southeast, you got to climb pretty high to get into that deep and cold moisture there, most of that between 6,000 and 10,000 feet, and also across the Alaska Peninsula above 10,000 feet for you. Here's a jet stream, the main driver of our surface weather. You can see the fast-moving winds there around 30,000 feet, taking a big nosedive across the North Pacific, and then returning that flow with moisture in hand all the way up into southeastern Alaska. Wind speeds there from 140 to 150 50 knots. At 9,000 feet, low pressure sitting very close to Buckland with the winds rotating around in a counterclockwise fashion. That brings in north and west winds across the Bering at about 20 to 30 knots. A southwesterly flow still pretty strong across the Gulf at 30 to as strong as 50 knots by the time it gets into northern parts of southeast. And we have a northeasterly flow across the North Slope and the Arctic coast. That picks up a little bit more to 20 to 25 knots at 3,000 feet. Otherwise, the weather pattern's the same. It's just the wind speeds that are a little different. 15 to 25 knots from the north and west over Nunivak Island, reaching over the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island at about 15 to 30 knots, and about 10 to 40 knots across the northern parts of southeast and southwestern Alaska. So turbulence mainly along the western coast, and that makes sense with the high surf advisory again across St. Lawrence Island. A little bit of chop all the way from the North Slope down the west coast and Seward Peninsula and through the gaps and passes for parts of the Alaska Peninsula and into the northern Gulf, generally below 4,000 to 5,000 feet. That's a look at your aviation forecast. I'll be back with the rest of your marine weather here in just a few minutes. Stay tuned.
Bye-bye, Tetrad. Welcome to Stargazers. I'm Dean Regas, astronomer from the Cincinnati Observatory.
And I'm James Albury, director of the Kika Silva Pla Planetarium in Gainesville, Florida. Next week, we get to experience the fourth and final total lunar eclipse of the 2014-2015 Tetrad.
You might be asking yourself, what's a tetrad? Well, they're very rare, and in this week's episode, we'll tell you why.
We'll also give you the lowdown on the September 27th lunar eclipse. Let's show you. Here's how eclipses work. Celestial bodies cast two shadows, a darker inner shadow called the umbra, and a lighter outer shadow called the penumbra. Your location with respect to these shadows will determine the kind of eclipse you can see.
The geometry of the lunar eclipse is quite simple. First, the moon must be in the full phase, putting the Earth between the sun and moon. When the Earth, moon, and sun align perfectly, we get eclipses.
Because the moon's orbit is tilted by about 5 degrees with respect to the Earth's orbit around the sun, the Earth, moon, and sun rarely align. However, when they do, the moon passes through the Earth's shadow.
Since the Earth is so much larger than the moon, our entire shadow can cover the moon. How high above or below the Earth's shadow the moon passes determines the type of lunar eclipse we can see.
If the moon only passes through the Earth's penumbra, we have what's called a penumbral lunar eclipse. This causes only a slight dimming of the moon and is almost unnoticeable to the average moon watcher.
If only part of the moon passes through the Earth's umbra, the darker inner shadow, we have what's called a partial lunar eclipse. This causes a noticeable darkening of a portion of the moon's surface.
However, if the moon passes completely into the Earth's umbra, we have a total lunar eclipse.
Now, if you remember, 6 months ago we had a total lunar eclipse on April 4th. Well, it may surprise you to know that there is an almost 6-month pattern for eclipses. We call these eclipse seasons. The moon's orbit around the Earth is tilted, appearing almost like a dinner plate that is tilted with respect to a dinner table. The points of intersection between the moon's orbit and the plane of the Earth's orbit are called the nodes. If the new moon and full moon occur when the moon is at one of these nodes, we get an eclipse.
As the Earth orbits the sun, it carries the moon with it. These points of intersection allow the sun, moon, and Earth to align at almost 6-month intervals. So, for example, in April 2014, the new moon and full moon were aligned with the sun and Earth, and we experienced a total lunar eclipse, and 2 weeks later, there was a solar eclipse.
If we advance time 6 months to October, the new moon and full moon again aligned with the sun and Earth, and on October 8th, we saw another total lunar eclipse. And 2 weeks after that, on October 23rd, there was a partial solar eclipse.
Although the 6-month pattern of eclipses happens rather frequently, it's rare that you get 4 total lunar eclipses in a row. We call this a tetrad. A tetrad is an effect caused by the shape of Earth's orbit around the sun combined with the timing of eclipse seasons, and the sequence of tetrads varies over time.
For example, between 1582 and 1908, there were no tetrads. But there are 17 tetrads between 1909 and 2156. The previous tetrad occurred in 2003, 2004, and the next one won't start until 2032.
Okay, we've got our skies set up for Sunday night, September 27th at 9 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The moon will enter the penumbra at 8:10 p.m., but you won't notice anything exciting happen until just after 9 p.m. when the moon begins to enter the umbra.
Totality begins at 10:10 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Unlike the last 3 eclipses, everyone in the contiguous United States will be able to experience totality for this eclipse, from beginning to end.
Hallelujah! Now pray for clear skies though, because this is the last total lunar eclipse anyone will be able to see until January 2018.
The good news is that since the September 27th eclipse is in the early evening, there's no need to set your alarm clock.
Yay! So happy eclipse watching!
And remember to keep looking up.
When Tropical Storm Allison hit Houston in 2001, 16 of the 22 people who died were in their cars. Many more narrowly escaped.
And I started coming over this way and drove right into the ditch. Didn't know it was a ditch, thought it was the road.
As little as 2 feet of water is enough to float a vehicle. It's often difficult for drivers to assess the depth of the water and whether the roadbed has been washed away, which may create a hidden drop-off. If a car stalls, it can quickly be pushed downstream.
Why are people driving into these flooded low water crossing areas, and why aren't they avoiding them?
In the San Angelo, Texas National Weather Service office, Hector Guerrero met with local rescue workers to draw up a publicity campaign to combat the problem. They came up with the phrase, "Turn around, don't drown."
Anybody can come up with an idea, and thank God we came up with one we think that's effective and it's already helping to save lives.
In 2003, the phrase was adopted by the National Weather Service, the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes, and other partners as a national safety campaign.
We're developing public service announcements.
Turn around.
We've developed posters, we've developed brochures. We've even worked with the National Safety Council and the Department of Transportation's Federal Highway Administration to develop a new road sign.
The sign is bright pink and has begun to show up at low water crossings across the country.
Can you tell me one thing that you do remember about what we talked about in our last class?
Turn around, don't drown.
Turn Around, Don't Drown is now being taught in schools across the country, with the hope of influencing the next generation of drivers.
Water is really strong. I wouldn't take any risks.
The hopes behind the education efforts are high, because this tragedy never has to happen. For the Weather Channel, I'm meteorologist Nick Walker.
Nick Walker even sings a song, if I'm not mistaken, that includes Turn Around, Don't Drown. You can Google that if you want to for your own time there. And flooding can happen anywhere, which means anywhere that you're in a vehicle of any size, whether it's a car, truck, SUV, tank, Humvee, they all float. It just depends on the amount of water. Most vehicles take about 6 inches there before you lose traction. Once you lose traction, your car can float, at least for a moment. So be careful out there. Turn around, don't drown. You will hear that a lot. Here's a look at the winds in southeast. Strong southerlies are diminishing as we get into Friday. 20 to 35 knots in the north, 15 knots coming in from the south and southwest across the outer coast, a little bit stronger up around Yakutat with 11-foot seas. Winds diminish even more as we get into Saturday. A light easterly wind around Icy Cape, and with a west and southwesterly flow coming in towards Sitka and the Dixon entrance, a little bit more from the north and west. Southerlies will continue across the inner coastal areas, 20 to 25 knots with 2 to as high as 5-foot seas in the Lynn Canal. For south central, a southeasterly flow inside of Prince William Sound, a little bit stronger from the south on the outside of Montague Island. Southwesterlies coming up the western Gulf at 25 knots with 10 to 12-foot seas, and southerlies across Cook Inlet. Southerlies up to 10 knots there in the northern Cook Inlet. Around 3-foot seas are expected there. Westerlies take over as we head into Saturday. Remembering all the air is flowing offshore there. This could mean a brighter sky for the Cook Inlet region, but probably some gusts coming through the Barrens. 25 to 30 knots sustained winds with 8 to 9-foot seas there. 5-foot seas inside of Shelikof Strait with a westerly flow at 20 knots and easterlies inside of Prince William Sound at 10 knots. For Friday across Alaska's peninsula, a northwesterly flow in most areas. One exception would be from Castle Cape to Chignik, a southwesterly wind there at 20 knots with an 8-foot sea. 6 to 10-foot seas from Bristol Bay down the coast across the Alaska Peninsula's Bering Sea coast, and northwesterlies around Sandpoint and King Cove at 25 knots with an 8-foot sea. For Saturday, a southwesterly flow develops there on the northern coast at 20 knots with a 6-foot sea. Otherwise, northwesterlies continue from Bristol Bay and the Pacific coastline 20 to 25 knots with 6 to 8-foot seas on Saturday. Across the Aleutians, north and northwesterly winds will be the predominant direction there, with northwesterlies as strong as 25 knots from Unalaska to Nikolsky, 8 to 11-foot seas there, with 7-foot seas out across the west, and 15 knots become 30 knots from the south and west by Saturday, 20 to 30 knots from Kiska to Attu. With light and variable winds south of Unalaska and Nikolsky, we expect stronger southwesterlies on the northern side with a 6-foot sea, and 5 to 6-foot seas will be maintained for the central and eastern chain in most areas. Across the west coast, north and northwesterly winds at 25 to 30 knots. Remember that stronger northerly flow, especially on the northern coast of St. Lawrence, is causing high surf conditions there with waves as high as 8 to 12 feet. So beach erosion and some flooding is possible in those areas. 9-foot seas right now for tomorrow, so things should improve. And westerlies take over on Saturday, and a southwesterly flow for all other areas from St. Matthew to the Kuskokwim Bay and the Pribilofs, with 25-knot winds there and a 9-foot sea on Saturday. East and northeasterly winds for the Beaufort Seacoast. Freezing spray is now an issue there with cold enough waters and cold enough air blowing through. 7 to 9-foot seas are expected for the Chukchi Seacoast, and northerlies at 30 knots through the outside areas of Kotzebue Sound. Those diminish to about 15 knots as we get into Saturday. Northeasterlies coming down the Chukchi Seacoast, and a broad easterly flow sweeps over the Beaufort Seacoast, again with freezing spray still a threat as we get into the beginning of the weekend with 8 to 9-foot seas for the Beaufort Seacoast there. Recapping tonight's weather, flood advisories continue for parts of southeastern Alaska. Moderate to occasionally heavy rainfall is expected to continue as we go through your Friday. Already, 1 to 3 inches of rain has fallen. We expect storm totals upwards of 3 to 6 in general, but there's certainly room for heavier amounts to be found across parts of the Panhandle as we go into the weekend. As we look at Prince William Sound and areas to the west, occasional showers and thunderstorms will be possible. Some of that will spread into the coastal areas of southeast tomorrow. As low pressure continues tracking northward, it's guiding in northerly and colder wind down the west coast. Periods of rain will be found there, but periods of rain and snow will mix across the north slope and north of the Brooks Range, especially as low pressure continues to drag in more moisture and precipitation to just about all parts of Alaska as we get into Saturday. Snow showers will continue across the north slope with periods of westerly wind coming in across the west coast. Watch for rain to continue in places like Norton Sound as we get into Saturday. That's your Alaska weather. Have a good night.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.